and it was just an entirely different game back then. So anyway, Chuck's going to talk a little bit about the economics of baseball then, maybe some legal stuff as well, and then talk about the Cubs and the Sox back in the day. So Chuck, take it away.
Thank you, David, and thank you guys for coming in this heat wave, third and fourth heat wave of the summer as we suffer along here towards the dog days. Dog days for the Cubs, routine days for the White Sox, and hopefully better than dog days for the Bears as they're coming up. But like David said, um, we're going to talk a little bit more. We'll talk about the on-field stuff and some of the anecdotes about the players back in the day. But we'll even go before earlier than 1945, and we'll go later than 1959 to talk about how history repeats itself, how baseball has changed, but in some ways things stay exactly the same. And I want to start out with a piece from the Chicago Sun-Times, June 13th, 1967. And as I read this, think about Jerry Reinsdorf and his ill-fated pitch, no pun intended, last year to have the city and the state build him a new stadium on what's known as the 78. So I'll just read this and see, uh, then you can kind of ask yourself, what does this remind me of? On this date, Arthur Allen, owner of the White Sox, proposed a $50 million stadium arena complex for the city of Chicago. The site Allen suggested was in the downtown area, immediately south of the Loop, on the railroad air rights above the Dearborn Station and the trackage area. That, of course, is the area immediately south of the Pennsylvania Railroad Freight Warehouse and Roosevelt Road overpass, and that is the 78. So going back to 1967, somebody thought of it. It would encompass 50 acres. The gigantic complex built on stilts would include three separate stadiums. One would be designed for baseball, seating 46,000, another for football and soccer with a capacity for 60,000, and a third for basketball and hockey, which could handle 15,000. The target date for the completion, according to Allen's architects, was 1972. Allen continued to push for this athletic compound until he sold the White Sox in 1969, but his dream failed to materialize. So it's interesting how things go full circle. Some ideas are recycled, some are just kind of rehashed, and some are just doomed to fail from the beginning. Like I did with my 63 Bears book, which I know some of you fellows picked up when I was here, I like to get into more than just the on-field won and loss, coaching and player history. I like to get into the economics and the legal issues and some of the financial issues and hardships that professional sports uh, is always seems to be encumbered with. The fights between management and employees, between players and owners and so forth. And let's just start with that, and we'll go all the way back before 1945. We'll go to the 1930s, the early 1930s, when the Depression hit. The Depression was extremely hard on baseball, and it was particularly hard on the owners. Most of the baseball owners then had their team as their primary and only assets. We're talking about teams like the Red Sox, the Yankees, and the Cubs being owned by individuals that have big interests in other industries. But for the most part, team owners owned the team, like Chuck Comiskey. His sole asset was the White Sox. Connie Mack, his sole asset was the Philadelphia Athletics. Mack was a very civic-minded Philadelphia citizen. He had, from the ground up, developed a team that won consistently in the World Series and won pennants consistently. When the Depression hit, he was worth about $80,000. And being a good Philadelphia citizen, he took his $80,000 and put $20,000 in four different Philadelphia banks. After 1932, his total portfolio was worth $20,000 because three of the banks failed. And of course, then we didn't have FDIC. After that, the Philadelphia Athletics never won another pennant. They sold off player after player after player. Al Simmons sold to the White Sox. Jimmy Fox, not around very long. So on and so forth. So it was hard, and it was especially hard on the White Sox. We'll talk a little bit about the White Sox, and then we'll talk about the Cubs in the 30s as well. As far as the White Sox goes with that, Chuck Comiskey never was the same man after the Black Sox scandal. All through the 20s, the White Sox suffered. They didn't do well. They didn't have the fan base, and they didn't have the success on the field that almost every other team in baseball had. And Chuck himself was extremely dispirited. The last 10 years of his life were very, very sad, and he died in 1930. On the other side of town, with the Cubs, very different. William Wrigley, one of the most innovative and forward-thinking businessmen in American history, bought the team from Charles Wigman in the 1910s, 1916 to be exact, and turned the Cubs into a team that through the 30s until 1945 won five pennants and finished in the first division 12 times. Wrigley was way ahead of his time. One of the first things he did was he embraced radio. The Cubs were on the radio in 1924 on five stations. He didn't collect one dime from any of the stations. He was friends with a man named Albert Lasker, a Lake Forest guy who was a pioneer in advertising, who knew that all publicity is good, even bad publicity, and free publicity is the best of all. Wrigley took that, told every radio station in Chicago, you can broadcast my games. I'm not going to charge you a thing for it. You broadcast my games, you sit on the roof. At that time, Wrigley Field had one story. You sit on the roof, bring your own equipment, broadcast the games. Radio stations fell for it. It's 3 hours of entertainment where they didn't have to pay their house pianist, their house singers, their house choirs. How many remember their radio orchestras? This was free airtime from the radio stations, and it was free advertising, of course, for Wrigley. He also was very, very ethical in terms of how he spent his time and how he compensated himself. He owned the gum company, and he owned the Cubs, had a big investment and a big stake in Texaco Oil as well. Never took a salary from the gum company when he was at Wrigley Field. And he never took a dime of Cub money and put it in his own pocket. He also would never take any gum money and put it into the Cubs. All of the additional Cub expenses over and above the money that they had coming in, he would take out of his own pocket. So he was kind of an owner, more like Steve Cohen of the Mets, more like George Steinbrenner of the Yankees, than he was like Jerry Reinsdorf or the Ricketts that we have today. When he died, kind of unexpectedly in 1930, he was worth $40 million. Forbes magazine, when he died, said that he was probably amongst the 100 wealthiest men in the country. $40 million in 1931 is about 2.1 billion today. Interestingly enough, he kept the baseball team and also the stadium out of the family trust, and he willed those directly to Philip. Now, the reason he split the team from the stadium in those days was for some reason you could depreciate stadiums differently than you could the team as an asset, and there was a big tax advantage to him doing that. But that's one of the reasons why Phil Wrigley always refused to sell the team. This is the one thing that my father gave me out of his own feelings and out of his own heart and left out of the trust. I'm never going to sell it. The first thing Philip did, talking about being fan oriented instead of profit oriented, is he reduced the number of seats in the box seat areas from 8 to 6. And his financial guy, the Crane Kenny at the time, said to him, "What are you doing? Oh my God, These are the most expensive tickets we have. This is where most of our profit comes from. Why are you cutting it 25%? Because I'm cutting it 25%, first of all, because there's a depression going on, number one. Number two, these are the folks that buy season tickets and who are our most loyal and consistent customers. If they're not comfortable and they're not happy, we're really going to have a problem. So I'm going to see to it that we're going to cater to them, even if it costs us a little money. A very, very different tact than other baseball players, other baseball owners were doing. Of course, George Halas was a tenant of Wrigley Field in those days. The rent was 10% of the gate, unless there were more than 25,000 people in those days, in which case it was 20% of the gate. And the first thing Halas did when he had the money was he put all of those seats in storage that were 21 inches wide and bought 18-inch seats and then put 8 seats in the box. He didn't care if the fans were comfortable or not. He just wanted to make more money doing that. Philip went on, as most of you guys know, the Cubs had lights, and the lights were all being stored in the concourse below. And then when World War II came, Wrigley says, well, you know what, we might not even be playing baseball. So instead of using the lights, I'm going to give the lights to the Navy. And those light towers are still in the Philadelphia Navy Yard in Pennsylvania. So the other thing, in terms of his radio and his media acumen, the Cubs were one of the few teams in the 40s to make money off media. Nowadays, you look at the percentage of the team revenue, which is from media, and it's close to 60% for some teams. But in 1945, the Dodgers were making $150,000 a year from radio rights. That was the most lucrative radio contract of any team in baseball. The Cubs were making $40,000 a year in 45 from their radio revenue on WMAQ. Doesn't sound like a lot of money. The average baseball player at the time was making $5,000 for his 6-month job. That's at the time in 1945 when the average salary for a family of four was $2,000. So ball players are making 200% of the average wage for 6 months of work. And with Wrigley's $40,000 from radio rights, he can pay for 8 players. It's a little tough for some of the teams now, especially in small markets, to pay for 8 players out of their media revenue. It's just not there. The story is very different on the South Side through the Depression and through the 40s with the White Sox. When Chuck Comiskey died in 31, he was worth $1.5 million, which is the equivalent of about $35 million today. His son Lou took over. Lou was morbidly obese, had health problems. He was so infirm that he had a private room constantly reserved for him at Presbyterian St. Luke's Hospital. That's how often he was hospitalized in Sophia. He took the team over. The Sox lost a lot of money during the Depression. They averaged 5,400 fans per game during his 10 years of ownership. The worst year was 1932, when the White Sox averaged 2,800 fans per game. The Cubs over the same period averaged 11,500 people per game and drew 1.4 million, first team to draw over 1 million people in 1930 and over 1 million in 1931. The Sox finished over 500 only 3 times from 1930 to 1945. They had very, very poor, some years almost no radio revenue. They were making about $10,000 a year as late as 1945 from the radio. One of the saviors of the White Sox is somebody that people have kind of forgotten about or they never knew in the first place. A man named Harry Grabiner was born in 1891. At the age of 14, he came to Sox Park and said, you know what? After school, I'd be glad to be a groundskeeper for you guys. Chuck Comiskey took a shine to him, put him out. One day he's goofing around and he's talking to the guy, the accountant or the bookkeeper that's doing the concession revenue for the game. Rabiner saw the list, added it all up in his head without a pencil, and told him what the amount was. The guy told Chuck Comiskey, this kid that you got doing the groundskeeping, my God, he's a math whiz. He just these numbers in his head. Comiskey took him on as an office boy. He worked his way up to general manager. By the time Chuck Comiskey died, Rabiner was probably the most important man in the White Sox system. And without Harry Rabiner, Lou Comiskey took over after his father died, would have gotten nowhere. He knew the Sox were losing money every year. He knew that Cincinnati and St. Louis had done pretty well with lights. First year the St. Louis Browns had lights, they had 14 night games and they had 63 day games. They drew more people in the 14 night games than they did in all 63 day games. Wow. Rabiner said, okay, you know what? Let's have lights. Well, do we have the money? I don't know if you have the money or not, but you know what? You can borrow against team's equity and you can get lights. White Sox have lights. First night game they had, they drew 51,000 people. They hadn't done that since the 1920s, right after the Black Sox scandal. So, unfortunately, Lou dies. Lou dies, and this is the big story in my White Sox book in the beginning. Team is willed, and all of his assets go to his wife, Grace Comiskey. Grace Comiskey, at the time, inherited Lou's $2.25 million, about $100 million today. And the First National Bank was in charge of handling the trust, and they were also the executor of Lewis's will. They say to Grace, well, we hate to tell you this, but your team has lost $675,000 over the last 10 years. That's about $70,000 a year, and that represents over 10% of your gross revenue. You got a business where over 10% of the gross revenue every year is a loss. And we've got, we have a fiduciary right with this trust, and we have some ideas. There might be a war coming. Pennsylvania Railroad has paid a dividend for 100 years in a row. They're the ones that take the raw materials to Cleveland and Indianapolis and Detroit and Chicago. Factories turn them into ovens, stoves, tanks, guns, and ship them back to the East Coast. Let's sell the White Sox and start buying Pennsylvania Railroad stock and New York Central stock. And let's start buying some aircraft stock and stuff like that. She throws a fit. Remember, this is also when women had very few rights legally when it came to financial things. She says, we're not selling the team. I'm not selling the team. I refuse to go along with this because it's part of family legacy. The White Sox and the name Comiskey go way back. We're keeping the team. Well, you're losing money and you're going to keep losing money and you can only do this for 2 more years. So I don't care. I'm going to renounce the will. Well, nobody renounces the will. What are you talking about? He said, I'm going to claim my dower rights. Now, I know you guys retired or current lawyers. It's an old English term. I'm a layman when it comes to a lot of the legal terms, but I had a lot of help from a guy that did a lot of estate planning in the 50s. Back in England, when the farmer died, so that the wife and the family, I'm being quick and glib here, would not be destitute. She could claim her dower rights, renouncing everything the farmer had except for the farm, all the implements, all the animals, so on and so on. So she had a place to live. She had a way to sustain herself. Grace claimed her dower rights. The First National Bank says, "You're a woman. Yeah, we have a fiduciary right here. We're giving you responsible and legally sound ideas on how to keep the trust alive." She said, "No, I'm going to sue to keep the team, and I'm claiming my dower rights. So I renounced the will, and all I wanted the White Sox, which was his property." I don't know who the lawyer was at the time. It's in the book, but I forgot his name. He gets a friendly judge from Beverly Hills, Beverly Morgan Park area, in probate court, and she wins. This is headline news, and it should be mentioned. A female, a widow, who's the third or fourth most significant bank in the country, their trust department, and wins and gets to keep the team. The trouble is, kind of ruined the team. She didn't do much good with the team at all. Now with the lights, Terry Grabiner's idea, the White Sox they would often never make much profit at all, but they only lost money 1 year in 1942 after they put lights in. Lou was so fond and so appreciative of Terry Grabiner's work that he put in his will that Harry could be a White Sox employee for the next 10 years at $25,000 a year. $25,000 in 1940, tremendous amount of money. She fires him after 5 years. She doesn't trust him. She thinks that he was behind some of the ideas to sell the team. Another person that she starts to get on and make life difficult for was Jimmy Dykes. How many of you guys remember the name Jimmy Dykes? White Sox manager in the 30s and the 40s. He kept the team going. Rabiner and Dykes had this theory. We're going to do double headers on Sunday. We're going to pray for good weather on Sunday. And then maybe we'll draw 500,000 people. When we draw 500,000 people, we break even. That's all we got to do. We just got to break even. We just got to break even. Team's going up in value a little bit. They can pay salaries, everything else. Well, she fires Dykes and she fires Harry Rabiner. She hires Judge Landis's right-hand man, a guy that didn't know anything about baseball, but there was a very clever and savvy accountant named Leslie O'Connor. Leslie O'Connor reads in the paper about a kid named George Zoderman. George Zoderman was from the private school league, the white division, excuse me, the red division, which was the higher of the two in terms of athletic skill, at Chicago Christian High School. Chicago Christian was a league with Morgan Park Academy, North Park Academy, Luther North, Luther South, some of the bigger private schools in the city. So Zoderman's only a junior, and Leslie O'Connor gives him a contract. He hears from Happy Chandler, the commissioner. He says, "You can't sign him. He's still in high school. His class hasn't even finished high school. He's not even a dropout. If there's a dropout, maybe there's a chance you could sign him, but you can't sign him." And O'Connor says, "Of course I can. This is a free country. Your laws are the laws of the as a citizen are superseded by baseball's edicts about who we can sign and who we can't sign." "No, they're not. Take me to court." Went to court and he lost. O'Connor still refused to rescind the contract to Zoderman. So the White Sox, sorry, White Sox fans, became the first team in history to be banned from the league. They had their schedule rescinded. They were not allowed to make trades. They were not allowed to purchase any more players until they cleared up the Zoderman issue.
Sorry, Chuck, what year was this?
47.
47.
This was a huge embarrassment for Grace and for Leslie O'Connor. At the same time, her son, Chuck Comiskey II, the guy that we know, and the guy that's got the statue at Sox Park now, was getting out of college, the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul. He comes in, kind of a wise guy at the time, but he comes in to work at the team. The first thing he does is he needs somebody, an older man, an experienced baseball guy that can play the game. He hires Frank Lane. Frank Lane was a wheeler dealer at the time. He was the head of the Columbus Clippers and the president of the, I think, the Free Island, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. So Lane comes in. He and Chuck Comiskey put the entire team on waivers. The entire team is on waivers. Only one person was claimed. So they know they got to get to work. They get to work, and they do an awfully good job at it. In 1949, they got Billy Pierce, a 3-year, rarely used left-hander from the Tigers, for Aaron Robinson. The following year, they got Nellie Fox, a high school dropout, who was semi-literate, from the Philadelphia Athletics. Connie Mack thought he much too small and much too frail to be a major leaguer. Fox, second most infrequent strikeout rate of any baseball player in history. Struck out 1.2% of the times that he batted. They got Jim Busby, a great center fielder before Jim Landis. They got Chico Carrasco from Venezuela, one of the first Latin American shortstops, who eventually was replaced, of course, by Louis Aparicio. And they hired Paul Richards, the starting catcher in the 45 World Series for the Tigers, who was seen as one of the great baseball minds at the time, but also a great developer of pitchers. In 1950, they got Sherman Lawler, and they got Jungle Jim Rivera from the St. Louis Browns, and in a very complicated trade, at Manny Minoso, we're going to talk about in a minute or two. He also was one of the first general managers, Lane, with Comiskey, to raid the Latin American countries and pitchers. They got Louis Aloma, they got Sandy Consuegra, and knowing that huge number of White Sox fans were drawn from areas like Marshall Boulevard and Taylor Street and Hyde Park. We got to get some Jewish players. So along comes Saul Rogovan, Marv Rotblat. I was lucky enough, Marv Rotblat died about 5 years ago at the age of 99. 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to run into him. And when I was writing the Cubs book, and he's quite a character. A little footnote here about Marv Rothblatt. We invited him to speak at a baseball banquet, and he gets up. He played for the Sox for like 2 years. Started maybe 12 games in his major league career. A little guy, maybe 5'6", Harvey Haddix type player. Greg Maddux, real small. He gets up and he says, "Yeah, I played for the White Sox, and I had argued with Frank Lane about salary. He finally gave me $7,000 for the season, and the average guys were making 5,000." And he said, this is in front of a banquet crowd, mixed banquet crowd. He says, "But I'm going to tell you about my greatest day in baseball." And his son is sitting there and says, "Dad, Dad, Dad." "Oh, no, really, this is the greatest day in baseball I had. I played Cleveland. I was called into relief in the sixth inning. We won in 10 innings. They got 2 hits off me between the sixth inning and the 10th inning. I got back to the hotel. I had 2 Cleveland broads in my room all night. It was the best night of my life." But that's the White Sox. Same thing with Jungle Jim Rivera. Jungle Jim Rivera would not be in professional sports in the hashtag Me Too era. He was arrested during World War II for spending too much time with an officer's daughter at a dance, and the enlisted men were verboten to consort, visit, socialize with any members of the officer's family. She cried foul, and he went into the brig. He was there for life, supposedly. He was on the prison baseball team, and then they played a minor league team in Missouri, and he was like 4 for 4. The owner of the St. Louis Browns goes crazy and sees him playing and everything else. Paul Stewart Symington, who was a young politician, a congressman at the time from Missouri, and he says, there's a guy in a federal prison we played against. My God, he's got the best arm I've ever seen, and I can't believe the way this guy hits. What would it take to get him out of the rig? You know how, especially in the 40s, if you know the right people and things go on, next thing you know, he's in the minor leagues for 6 months, and then after that, he's on the Browns. The White Sox got him eventually. And Rivera, then, of course, the problems didn't end with Jim at that time. His first season with the White Sox, the last game of the season in Comiskey Park, there's 2 policemen waiting for him in the Sox locker room. And they have a warrant. They're going to take him in. What's the problem? There's a complaint of you by a neighbor. He sees her name. Her. He offered to help a young widow in his apartment building with her groceries up the stairs and so forth in Hyde Park. And apparently, according to her story, took too many liberties with her after the groceries were put away. And it wasn't the first time this happened. So the White Sox, oh my God, we need this guy in the outfield. He's a complete, what are we going to do with him? They found a good criminal lawyer who also insisted on a jury trial. They packed the jury with a bunch of guys from Marshall Boulevard and from Beverly and from Morgan Park. The next thing you know, he's not guilty. It's his word against her. He goes on from there. The White Sox were warned by Ford Frick, you can't trade him. You can't promote him. You're stuck with him. We want him out of baseball if anything else happens. But it's going to be out of baseball after he does something with you guys. This is the White Sox luck at the time. Kind of crazy. In fact, very, very strange the way all that came down. So, going back to Minoso. Cubs, who we'll talk about in a few minutes. The Cubs, of course, won the pennant in 45. And with a mix of young guys and old guys who were out of the war. Andy Pafko got out because of the fact that he had high blood pressure. Phil Cavaretta had daughters born before World War II started, which was an exemption. Claude Passau was a farmer. He had a tung oil farm in Mississippi. All of these which was a job critical to the war effort. These are the reasons why the Cubs had who they had in 45. And by the time the 50s rolled around, Pafko and a little bit later than that with him, Hank Sauer were the big names with the Cubs. Pre-Ernie Banks, post World War II pennant in 45. Pafko, he's one of the most popular guys on the team. He was kind of like the Ron Santo of the time. He was a farm guy from Eau Claire area, Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Thick Wisconsin accent. Married woman he met at his Lutheran church on the northwest side of Chicago. Bought a two-flat, which he lived in until he was 85, in the Kelvin Park neighborhood of Chicago. Had a huge following in Chicago, and then a statistic that very few people know about, but is one of the reasons why he's on the Cubs All-Century team as their center fielder. And I wish Adam Dunn were here, because as an ex-White Sox, Adam Dunn needs to hear this. Pafko in 2 years hit more home runs than he struck out. And in 1951, he hit 35 home runs and struck out 31 times. Could you imagine today the hoopla on sports radio if a pro baseball player hit more home runs than he struck out? That's unheard of. By the way, we were talking about Ted Kluszewski over here. Kluszewski did that 4 times in his career. Nobody's done it since. Barry Bonds did, but I don't usually count Barry Bonds in when we talk about this. He's the only other one. So Pafko goes to the Dodgers for 4 players and a bucket of balls. Trade that even Phil Wrigley didn't like. 1 month after that, the White Sox get Minnie Minoso from the Cleveland Indians. Marketing move. He's the first dark-skinned player in Chicago. He's a Latino. The Sox are getting a larger and larger Latino base in their fan base. He also almost Willie Mays like 5 tool player. Minoso could run, he could hit, he could field, he could hit for power, he could throw. In his first game for the White Sox, he hit a ball into the White Sox bullpen in center field. That had only happened about 7 times in history for that. In the first 25 games that Minoso was on the team, Sox won 21 of them. He changed the entire team. So suddenly you've got Fopp, you've got Pierce, you've got Lawler, you've got Rivera, you've got Chico Carrasco, you've got Jim Busby. The Go-Go Sox are born. They're on their way. Every year between 1950 and 1967, the Sox outgrew the Cubs in attendance, except in 1958. If you remember 1958, there was a huge recession in this country, big steel strike. Attendance was down in all of baseball. The Cubs had an off year, and the Sox were still in pennant contention. The Go-Go Sox were born. Young Chuck Comiskey and Lane had put together a great team. Every year they'd finish second, sometimes third, always to the Yankees. Then his mother dies in '56. She had an in and out relationship, to say the least, with her son, and she willed 54% of the team to her daughter, Dorothy, and she willed 46% to Chuck. He was furious. And then they go to war. I have a cheat sheet, which I include with the book on the White Sox, talking about the 8 lawsuits between Dorothy, the older daughter, and Chuck, the only son, over who's going to control the team. He gets sick of it. He says, okay, that's it. That's it. I'm tired of this. I've got 2 daughters who own horses. I want to have a normal life. I want to get out of the baseball. I want to sell a team. Chuck wants to buy the team. She won't sell it to him. She starts talking. Leo Fisher of the Chicago American sees that Bill Veeck is in the New Orchard airport one day. He takes a cab to Sox Park. She's talking to Bill Veeck about buying the team. Veeck gives her a $200,000 promissory note. He had a syndicate, the CBC syndicate. 3 very wealthy guys from New York, Veeck, and also Hank Greenberg, who Veeck idolized. Anyway, so who wants to buy the team? She says, what's the offer? Offer is made. Because remember, she's selling half the team, but it's the controlling half, 54%. And he says, okay, we settle on this, and here's how we'll draw it up. And I'm going to give you $250,000 promissory note that binds my offer into the contract. You can't sell to anybody else. She says, fine. So 2 weeks go by. A name that very few people associate with the White Sox rises up from the depths and enters the scene. Charles O. Finley. Finley was a young insurance magnate who had made fortune selling malpractice insurance to physicians and physician groups and hospitals and so forth. He really wanted in on baseball. He turns around and he says to Dorothy, you know, Beck offered you 3.2 million for this team for half the team, 54%, and heck, I'll offer you 3.6 million. So let's just, I'm going to give you more money. You should sell it to me. She says, yeah, you're right. I should do that. She didn't understand about the promissory note to Beck. So Beck finds out about this with his group. They have a conniption fit and they sue. And the judge says, no, no, no. If you're going to sell the team, you already refused to sell it to your son, to your brother. If you're going to sell the team, you have to sell it to Beck because you signed this promissory note and you've got a contractual obligation to sell it to him. So she loses out on the money. Of course, she looks like a fool, not knowing this. And Bill Beck buys the team. Hank Greenberg runs the organization. Beck owns it. And Hank Greenberg and Chuck Comiskey are like oil and water. They can't get along. They can't do anything. One of the biggest helps I had in writing my White Sox book, believe it or not, was Bill Beck's wife. He was 95, still sharp. This is, I'm talking about 2020, now 2021. Still sharp as a tack at the time, living in Montgomery Place. It was a nice retirement home in Hyde Park, right in front of Museum of Science and Industry. He told me that of all the thousands of people she met as a baseball team owner and with Bill and everything else, the most impressive person she ever ran into in her life, she ever came across, Hank Greenberg. She said Hank Greenberg, when he entered a room, was magnetism. Everybody turned around to see who it was. When he talked, everybody would look to see whose voice that was. When he was meeting people, other things, when he was solicitous, he said, a gentleman, also brilliant, and if he wasn't an athlete, he would have been brilliant at something else. Now, I gave this story at the Council for Jewish Elderly, where, he's considered like a demigod in the Jewish community. And the story, yeah, and he also, he knew how to marry too. He married Coral Gimbel. He did. His first wife, not Carol, but Coral, C-A-R-A-L, was Coral Gimbel, the daughter of the billionaire department store owner in Milwaukee. And then another guy gets up and he says, yeah, but he divorced her, and he did. Because she was running around with her horse group. She thought his baseball friends were uncouth, and the marriage didn't work out. But something was wrong with Corral because this is in the early 50s. He got custody of the kids. Men would almost never get custody in a divorce hearing in the early 50s. Rarely. So another guy gets up. He says, "Yeah, he married Corral Gimbal, and then they split up." And another guy says, and after that, he married that actress, that Shiksa actress. She wasn't even Jewish. She was a Shiksa actress. And after that, he couldn't hit it off. So, if you know anybody out there that's looking for mate selection, if they're ball players, maybe they should take Hank Greenberg's words to heart. So anyway, he sues. He loses. Beck's the owner. Chuck keeps going to court, spending all kinds of money to try to wrest control of the team away from Beck. And he can't do it. And he can't do it. And Beck is in a position where he really, really, really wants to own more than 54% of the team because then the depreciation of the asset is a much bigger deal. So the fighting goes on and on and on and on and on. And then after the World Series in 1959, this is Chuck's revenge. This is how he gets even with Beck and Greenberg and the rest of them. He loses the team, but he wins the war. Chuck told back after the World Series when the team's value was up about 70% because of their high attendance and they won the pennant and they had a good young team. I want to sell my 46%. I want to offer it to you to get a generous tax write-off. Vex Group had to control 80% of the team within 1 year of the purchase. This would mean a savings of about $2 million in 1960 money now in taxes. So we're talking about $40 million for an asset worth about $3 million. So can't wait to buy it. Partial purchase, however, would complicate other matters. Vex Group can do so. They'll save over $2 million in federal income taxes, which of course was a fortune in 1960. This comes from a complicated formula on how much players' value you can depreciate if you own 80% of the team within 1 year. So they really only want to buy 26% of Chuck's stock, which would get them to the 80% mark, and then let him keep the rest. Chuck is no fool, and he knows that the Sox are perhaps the hottest property in the American League. And he tells them that the value of the team is $7.4 million. He gets this figure by saying that since they made the World Series and had such a good profits, the team's value is 50% more than it was when Vec bought his 54% of the team at $2.7 million. So if 54% of 2.7 million of the team value was 5 million, it's up to 50% in value. The new value is 7.4 million. Beck says, "Oh, you're crazy. No baseball team is worth $7.4 million. What are you talking about?" At the same time, their mother's will and trust finally went through probate. It took 2 years. Excuse me, it took 4 years. Finally got through probate, and the probate court valued the team at $7.4 million. They ironically agreed with Chuck's number. So Vec is over a barrel. He's got to pay Vec even more. And then Dorothy comes a calling and says to Vec's Group, "We really hit him over a barrel. Well, you know, there's a little codicil in the contract, the sales contract, that says if you purchase the team or any more stock for more money than you paid for my stock just a year ago, you have to reimburse me at the new rate the stock is." So he would end up giving $750,000 more money to Dorothy just to complete the sale. Over a barrel. The White Sox were over a barrel. Beck didn't have a nervous breakdown, but his health kept breaking after this. He was also a 5-pack-a-day man. He had what some people thought was a brain aneurysm. It was actually constricted veins and arteries in his head from all the nicotine and all the smoking. He got sicker and sicker, had to sell the team. Sold the team, of course, to Arthur Allen. Another guy wanted to buy the team, Saul Epton, the same guy that ran for mayor in 1982. He was a personal injury lawyer who had made a fortune in Chicago. He was a young guy at the time. He was a silent partner with Chuck Comiskey. When Vic found out that Comiskey was involved with Epton, wasn't interested in selling to him. Another guy came along, a guy that's kind of a profane word in Milwaukee, a guy from Winnetka, Mr. Bartholomew. He wanted to buy the White Sox, and he did own the minority. Comiskey finally sold his interest in the White Sox to Bartholomew, and Bartholomew got out in 6 months because the Arthur Allen Group would have absolutely nothing to do with him. At the time, Bartholomew started talking to the Haneys, who owned the Milwaukee Braves, up until the day, this is a sad story, but up until the day that the moving vans moved the team's equipment and belongings from Milwaukee to Atlanta. He was telling the Milwaukee Journal that the Braves are going to stay in Milwaukee forever. So Bartholomew is it's persona non grata. Almost the name is almost a profanity. A little bit north of the Cheddar Curtain, and for good reason as well. Well, as we all know, to make the longer story a little shorter with the Sox, the Allens did absolutely nothing with the team. Arthur Allen had never been to a baseball game before he owned the White Sox. He was a huge, world-renowned butterfly collector. Good Lord, that's all we need today is to find out that the McCaskies or that, one of the Ricketts collects butterflies, and then there goes the idea that they're competent owners. Allen couldn't do anything with the team. Team got worse and worse. Eddie Stanky was hired as manager. Stanky, who kind of had a reign of terror, got in trouble with the league for freezing the baseballs at Comiskey Park before the game, and for doctoring up the field. He would water down the infield when they knew that a sinker ball pitcher was pitching against the White Sox. He would also put gasoline and burn the play in front of home plate when there was a fastball pitcher so that any foul ball that would come would get to the infield more quickly. The league got a hold of all this. Stanky got in all kinds of trouble. Soon he was gone. Chuck Tanner came in. This was the same time you Sox fans probably remember when Arthur Allen made the sad mistake of making the infield AstroTurf and the outfield natural grass. That looked kind of strange, to say the least. And it didn't work out well either. And then the crowning blow, insult to White Sox fans, Bud Selig, big car dealer in Milwaukee, who was a huge baseball fan and was furious that the Braves moved, talked Allen into having 14 games a year in Milwaukee, thinking that he could lure the White Sox out of the South Side and to move to Milwaukee. The games drew more people than the Sox did in those days. Remember, that was the DeRocher era with the Cubs. Everybody was paying attention to the Cubs. Sox could get nowhere with that. So, 14 games, nothing happened. After that, eventually Allen sells the team, and we know what happened from there. Bill Veeck came along. Veeck ran it as long as he could. He couldn't afford the free agent, astronomical salaries. So that's when Jerry took it, and that's where we are today. And now let's talk a little bit about the Cubs, because their stories are.
I just want to
I'm
ask
happy,
you,
yeah.
maybe we can open it up to questions.
Sure, yeah.
For those who want to ask about the White Sox.
Absolutely, yeah. Go ahead. Oh, come on, our pale hose are certainly worth a couple of questions.
What's your current opinion of White Sox? Is that a team that's going to stay in Chicago, or do you think
Well,
they're on an auction block?
Remember-
For that time?
if you remember a couple of years ago, all that talk about Nashville, and him talking to the mayor of Nashville, and anything else, the league put the kibosh on that for one reason. First of all, American League is not about to just hand a market like Chicago to the National League. It's not going to happen. The White Sox have had good seasons where they've outdrawn the Cubs. They'll have those again if they ever get good. So Major League Baseball does not want the American League out of Chicago. That's number one. Number two, teams moving to cities that don't have a team or never had a team. The advantage for the baseball and the baseball owners is when it's an expansion team. The way the Constitution for baseball is written now, an expansion team to get in the league, because they're buying you're buying a franchise that's in a league, that's in an organization. $50 million with the other teams in the league. Each team gets $50 million. If a team moves, so that's going to cost you. That's going to cost you over $1 billion just to start with, to join the league as a new team. But if a team moves and transfers cities, then there is no payment made by the team that's moving in. If Nashville, I mentioned Nashville because it's the name that always comes up.
Yeah.
If Nashville is going to get a team, it's going to be an expansion team, because that's where the money is for the owners. And the problem with baseball, you guys may respectfully or disrespectfully disagree with this, the problem with baseball is they really don't have a baseball commissioner. They have an owner's agent who acts as a commissioner. He's called commissioner. He's really an agent for the owners. All he is. You've got Manfred now running around the country when he isn't practicing his golf swing, talking about trying to talk the players into a salary cap. The players don't want a salary cap any more than the owners want a salary cap. If the players take a salary cap, the owners should take a salary cap on ticket prices and on hat prices and on changing the unit. This is a blasphemy. This changing of the uniform every couple of weeks just to sell more jerseys to people. So I don't think they're going to go anywhere. And if Ishbia is serious about eventually buying the team, and it could happen sooner than later, he's in a position, he's like Ricketts, except he's free with his money. All the money came from Dad, who's got that mortgage reinvestment company in Michigan. But we're talking like 35 billion, something like that. It's crazy money. And Reinsdorf never owned more than 30% of the team. Right now he owns 30%. When he bought it, he only owned 20%. But he made himself managing partner. And when he bought the team in 1980, he had something like 27 different partners. You could buy a partnership for as little as $60,000. And that's a lot of money in 1980, but it's not a lot of money if you're buying into a baseball team. And slowly but surely, these owners that he has, these minority owners, they're dying off. They want to liquidate. They want to settle their estate or their trust and so forth. Got kids in graduate school, so they're selling off the shares. There's a Reinsdorf, he wasn't born yesterday. He's a little bit of a snake in the grass. There's a clause in the sales contract for White Sox shares. The first refusal of the two Reinsdorf sons or Jerry himself. And they get to buy those shares at 80% part of it. So they're setting it up. Yeah. I mean, and why don't they win games? And then he wants the city to buy them, to build them a stadiums. At least Arthur Allen's idea for the 78 was private money. I won't get into private money being in stadiums, but I mean, that's the lay of the land. And for all of the things you may or may not disagree with Pritzker about, he's exactly right about that. You can't, if you can't fund the tollways, you have no business building a stadium. It makes no sense whatsoever.
So it's the other owners would require, obviously, prefer a payment from an expansion fee
Yes,
versus an existing team.
to move.
Moving, they're not going to vote for it because they're not getting any financial benefit.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the bottom line with that. So I want to find out from Dave, what are we doing time-wise?
Maybe another 10, 15 minutes.
Sure, yeah. They're a little different on the north side, and we'll talk a little bit about the 45 Cubs. Because, first of all, salaries. A lot better on the north side than the south side. In 1945, the Cubs had 5 players making $17,000 a year, and the average baseball player was making $5,000 a year. That was Stan Hack, Phil Cavarretta, Bill Nicholson, Hank Baroe, the pitcher they got from the Yankees, and Claude Casal, their best pitcher during World War II. By the way, Nicholson, name nobody remembers anymore. Bill Nicholson hit the longest, he led the league in home runs twice. He also hit the longest home run in Cub history. But he missed the scoreboard in 1947 by 4 feet. And the ball landed on the roof of raised bleachers across the street, bounced off the roof, and then hit a convertible that was driving past it. He missed it by 3 feet on the right field side. Roberto Committee missed it by about 4 feet on the left field side. Nicholson was an amazing hitter. There's a wonderful biography out on him. Married this beautiful model from Chicago. She was a real ingenue. And then he got traded to Philadelphia. And who owned the Philadelphia team but the DuPonts? Willie Carpenter was the son-in-law of the DuPont family. DuPont money was the Phillies money. So they get Nicholson, and of course along comes his wife. DuPont daughters were big time at the time. I'll call them international jet setters, even though we didn't have jets. And they were into the Paris fashion scene and all the artistic stuff in Berlin and everything else in the late 40s. And they took a real shine in Nicholson's wife because she was so beautiful and everything else. The poor guy, his wife falls in love with one. This is hush hush for the 40s. His wife falls in love with one of the DuPont daughters. They become a lesbian couple long before it's legal, long before it's talked about, everything else. And Bill's heartbroken the rest of his life. Interesting story. I think another player on the Cubs who I think belongs in the Hall of Fame, and there's absolutely no reason why he's not in, is Stan Hack. If George Kell and Phil Rizzuto and Ron Santo can get in the Hall of Fame, Stan Hack should have been there a long time ago. Hack had a lifetime on-base percentage of over 400. He was one of the best contact hitters in history. He was in 4 World Series, and his World Series batting average is .368. He's the reason the 45 series went to a 7th game when he doubled in the winning run in the 9th inning. against the Tigers, he's forgotten about now. And he's forgotten about largely, I think, for the same reason that so many other deserving players are. They didn't play on the East Coast. You look at who's in the Hall of Fame and who spent most of their time playing in Boston, in New York, in Philadelphia with the Athletics, in Washington, in Cleveland. Overwhelmingly, those are the guys that are in the Hall of Fame when others really don't deserve it. I think it kind of came to light when Stan Musial died, and the headline, and it wasn't a headline, it was a story on the beneath the fold in the New York Times that said they called him the best player in flyover history. Now, I mean, none of us are huge St. Louis fans, I don't think, but I mean, that's an insult. It's an insult even if you're tepid about St. Louis. But I think that's what happens with the Hall of Fame. Another guy, we talked about Pasco and what he did, but another guy that was an incredible player for the Cubs was Pascal, the pitcher. He was a tung oil farmer in Mississippi, one of the few players on the team with a college education. He went to Millsaps College, majored in agricultural science. I was lucky enough when I wrote the Cub book to talk to 7 players from the team that were still around. Pascal was about 94, still as sharp as a tack. He died the following year. But boy, he had stories like nobody's business. He's telling me, yeah, Wrigley Field, when I got there, because at first I played with Philadelphia and stuff, but much colder in Chicago, especially in April and May, sometimes September get cold. And I was a fastball and a curveball pitcher. I couldn't get my curveball to work at all in the cold weather. I always brought 3 bottles with me. It looked like clear spit. Nobody knew what it was. It was a real poor spit. It looked like clear spit. Nobody knew what it was. But you know what it was? The top liquid of the tung plant. Tung oil. First of all, he made a lot of money as a tung oil farmer because the Navy is always looking for waterproofing materials, and tung oil is one of the most natural. Expensive furniture, even today, will sometimes be tung oil treated. One of the best waterproofing agents there is. So he said, I had these huge contracts from the Navy from all my tung oil and so forth. But I always thought to it, I had like 3 or 4 bottles at the top of the liquid in my locker. Nobody knew what it was. I could put it here, I could put it there. I had the best curveball in the league in the cold weather, believe me. Because he was accused of being a spitball pitcher, but not necessarily. Then by the way, until Don Larson's no hitter, he pitched the best game in World Series history. Pitched a 1-hitter against the Tigers in Game 2 of the '45 World Series. He's going on a roll, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about money with him. Some of these guys talk freely about it, and some don't at all, and they're offended if you ask. So I said, well, so yeah, you were probably the best pitcher they had during the World War II era. What were you making in '45? And I could hear his chest swelling. He says, I'm glad you asked. There were 3 Cubs making highest salary: Nicholson, Hack, and Cavaretta. I'm not saying they didn't deserve it, but I was out there pitching all the time and everything else. And that year, I got a contract for $17,000. He says, I was damn proud of that. Now I was one of the highest paid players on the team. 17,000, and I picked up another almost 5,000 for losing the World Series. And I'm on a roll now. So I said, well, what did you do with your $5,000 in the World Series? That, by the way, was like double the family pay in 1945. We're not talking movie star money like the players make now, but we're talking surgeon's money. We're talking big money if you're making that kind of coin. So he said, well, I'm a tung oil farmer. I'm in Mississippi. I'm in a rural area, Loosedale. By the way, Steele, the Cubs pitcher, who's out now with a busted elbow, he's also from Loosedale, Mississippi. A small world. Anyway, he said, so, the war's over, and these farmers, they're all kind of backward down in Mississippi. They don't know, they didn't go to college. They don't know agricultural science. They don't know this, that, and the other thing. And I had an opportunity to buy a John Deere franchise. He said, now I kept hearing about all these highfalutin farm implements and so forth. I had a chance to get a dealership. So he said, I took all that money and put it into a dealership. He says, my 2 sons, they're in their 60s now. They're still running it. It's the biggest John Deere dealership in Mississippi. He said, and I had the first one. Oh, the guy's just going crazy, Lenny Marullo, who very sharp, erudite guy, the last player alive on the team. He was thrilled with this book, and he wrote me a 4-page letter talked about all kinds of stuff. He invested in an orange grove. A friend of his from Villanova was involved in commodities in New York and said, hey, you know what? Here's your World Series money. Put it in the orange grove. He said, I made double the amount that I gave him for the orange grove after 1 year, and then he insisted that I sell it back. So I had to say, he says, I didn't think you were going to make this much money. I want it back. So I sold it back to him. But he told me the best story, or at least the most sordid story, about the Cubs pennant. And then this would be an interesting thing to close on. Paul Derringer was the Cubs' fourth starter in 1945. It was the end of his career. He was on the Gashouse Gang Cardinals in the early 30s. He led Cincinnati to a pennant in 1940-41. A good pitcher, a big guy, also quite a drunkard and a bully. Had a real hard time, let's say, controlling his impulses. And the Cubs clinched the pennant in Pittsburgh that year. Second to the last game of the season, they win. Cardinals cannot catch them. They've managed to clinch the pennant. Big party in the locker room, and the beer is flowing. They didn't have champagne in those days. They had beer in the shower and all this and everything else. William Benswanger, the owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates, comes into the locker room to congratulate them on their victory. Benswanger is the son-in-law of Louis Dreyfus. Dreyfus Investments, one of the biggest investment guys in America at the time, based in Pittsburgh. So Benswanger, Dreyfus owns the Pirates, congratulating the players, talking to Charlie Grimm, the manager. Derringer sees him, points his finger at him, and says, "You little Jew, you little Jew. Not only did we beat you, we humiliated you guys." And Derringer was about 6'4", and Benswanger was about 5'6", picks him up by the elbows and throws him into the shower. Grimm went absolutely crazy. Two players tossed Derringer, take him away. And the next week, Derringer is off the Cub payroll, finishes his career in Indianapolis, goes on. The poor guy, he died in 1980, living hand to mouth as a janitor in a nursing home in Florida. His life and his career just kind of completely collapsed. But I said to Murillo, I said, now, I said, why are you telling me this? He said, well, a lot of stuff never got in the papers in those days. I said, yeah, I know, but I said, I think it's kind of an important story because we all had trouble with Derringer. And even though he won 17 games, he was insufferable. And he said, I was a street kid. And Murillo was literally about 5'9". I was a street kid and I know how to fight, and I was in a lot of fights. He beat up Dixie Walker in a Dodgers game, and he broke Eddie Stanky's nose once and everything else. And he said, but I'll tell you, being a street kid, an Italian street kid from Boston, you know who to fight, who to argue with. He says, I see a guy like that with his reach. I said, there's no way I'm going to, confront Derringer or anything else. If I can get even with him some other way, I will. So, people got to know about this. Anyway, I also read about it in another book on Derringer's life, and it's kind of as indicative of where the feelings were. But it was also a different era. Phil Wrigley insisted that Len Marullo room with Phil Cavaretta because they were the only two Italian guys on the team. And he just had this stereotype that nobody would want to room with an Italian guy. So those two guys roomed together. It was the same thing in the early 50s with the White Sox. Al Rosen, the big slugger for the Indians, he got pushed around a lot and teased and hazed for being Jewish in the minor leagues. In the offseason, he took up boxing. And then as soon as somebody would want to argue with him, he put up his dukes.
Chuck, let me,
Yeah.
that's a great story, Dan. Do you have books for sale out?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure everyone knew that.
I've got books, $3 each, if anybody's interested. I have more Sox books than Cubs books. My publisher for the Cubs book promised to get me another 20 before this talk. So if anybody, if I were to happen to sell out the Cubs books and somebody else wants a copy, we'll take your name and I'll see that they're delivered at the club as soon as I get them. Okay? Yeah.
And thank you. That was
Yeah.
fantastic.
Thanks.
You don't think you have to clutch the fire, you call it pretty hungry. My favorite story is somebody said, more money than stress is right. I thank you, sir. Yeah, take care. Good to see you.
Let me,
I'm gonna send it to you. The table works. That's good.
yeah,
Charlie, that's also.
sure thing. I'll sit in the shower.
Right here.
Stays here in LA.
LIS. Awesome. That's excellent.